Harlem had learned to recognize the sound of danger long before it arrived with flames or sirens. It came first as a change in posture, in the way men stopped lingering on stoops after dusk, in the way mothers pulled their children indoors a little earlier than usual, and in the way silence settled too quickly after certain names were spoken. In the late hours of an unseasonably warm evening, Reverend Samuel Powell stood alone inside his church, the sanctuary lights dimmed to a soft amber glow that barely reached the stained glass windows. The pews were empty, but the room still carried the echo of voices, songs sung with tired hope, prayers whispered through clenched teeth, sermons shaped by the quiet exhaustion of a people who had learned to ignore than they should have. Had to. Powell moved slowly down the center aisle, his shoes tapping gently against the worn wooden floor, his hand trailing across the backs of pews polished smooth by decades of faith. He paused at the pulpit, resting his palms against its edge, and let out a breath he had been holding since morning. The first letter had arrived 3 days earlier, slipped beneath the church doors sometime between the end of evening prayer and sunrise. There was no return address, no signature, only a few uneven lines written in block letters that seemed almost childish in their cruelty. The message was short, efficient, and unmistakable. Stop stirring trouble. Stop filling heads with ideas. Or watch your church burn. Powell had read it twice, then folded it carefully and placed it inside his Bible, not as a shield but as a reminder. He told no one at first, not the deacons, not the choir director, not the elderly women who arrived early every Sunday to dust the pews and straighten hymnals. He told himself that fear thrived on attention, that acknowledging it too loudly might give it more power than it deserved. But Harlem had taught him something else as well. Silence, when misunderstood, could invite escalation. By the third night, the windows along the church's east side were shattered. No fire came, but the message was clear enough. Powell knelt. Alone at the altar that night, the broken glass swept aside, but not replaced, moonlight cutting sharp angles across the sanctuary floor. He prayed not for protection, but for clarity. He had preached restraint his entire ministry, preached that dignity was not proven through retaliation, that justice moved slowly but deliberately when guided by moral conviction. Yet as he rose from his knees, he felt the weight of something pressing in from all sides, an unspoken question his congregation had begun to carry quietly among themselves. How long are we supposed to wait? Outside the church, Harlem continued its complicated rhythm. Jazz spilled from clubs along 7th Avenue, laughter and argument mingling beneath neon signs and street lamps. Men gathered at card tables on sidewalks, slapping down hands with practiced bravado, pretending the city did not watch them differently after dark. Power in Harlem did not announce itself the way it did downtown. It moved through understanding, through reputation, through men who spoke softly and were listened to anyway. And among those men, one name carried a gravity that did not need embellishment. Bumpy Johnson. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson Bumpy, to everyone who mattered, was not a man Harlem feared so much as a man it respected. He walked its streets with a posture that suggested neither apology nor aggression, his tailored suits immaculate, his voice calm, his eyes observant without being intrusive. He had grown up understanding exactly how quickly disorder invited destruction, and he had spent his adult life cultivating the opposite, balance. Where others chased notoriety, Bumpy cultivated restraint. Where others raised their voices, he lowered his. People who met him for the first time often found themselves surprised by the absence of menace, until they noticed something subtler, the way rooms adjusted around him, the way arguments softened when he entered, the way men who believed themselves powerful suddenly became careful with their words. That evening, Bumpy sat in his club, not at the center of attention, but not removed from it either. The music was smooth, the lighting deliberate, the crowd composed. This was not a place for chaos. It was a place where order was understood, where excess was discouraged, and where everyone knew the difference between strength and noise. Bumpy listened more than he spoke, his attention drifting easily between the band, the patrons, and the unspoken currents that moved beneath Harlem's nightly rituals. When a man approached to whisper something in his ear, Bumpy did not react immediately. He simply nodded once, dismissing the messenger with a glance that conveyed he had been heard. Across the room sat Dutch Schultz, older now, his earlier reputation tempered by years that had taught him the cost of reckless ambition. Time had reshaped Dutch's understanding of power. Where once he had demanded it, now he recognized it when he saw it exercised quietly. His relationship with Harlem was complicated, shaped by history that could not be undone, but could perhaps be understood differently in this era of shifting alliances. He and Bumpy shared no illusions about each other, but they shared something else, an appreciation for boundaries that, once crossed, brought consequences no one wanted. Church trouble. Dutch murmured when Bumpy's eyes met his. Words moving. Bumpy did not respond right away. He sipped his drink slowly, then set the glass down with deliberate care. Trouble moves fast when it thinks no one's watching, he said evenly. Meanwhile, Reverend Powell wrestled with his conscience. By the next morning, the letters had multiplied. Some were slipped beneath the church doors. Others appeared in his mailbox at home. The language grew bolder, the threats less veiled. Powell felt the weight of every word, not as a personal attack, but as a looming danger to the people who trusted him to lead with wisdom rather than fear. He called the police once, receiving polite indifference in return. There were no witnesses, no suspects, no urgency. Harlem had learned long ago that certain protections came slowly, if at all. That afternoon, Powell sat with his senior deacon, an older man whose hair had gone white before his patience ever did. They spoke quietly, voices low despite the empty room. The congregation's scared, the deacon said gently. They won't say it out loud, but they feel it. You feel it. Powell nodded. Fear spreads when it goes unacknowledged. And when words stop working, the deacon added, men start looking elsewhere for reassurance. Powell understood what he meant without needing it spelled out. There were names in Harlem that represented a kind of reassurance the city did not officially sanction, but quietly relied upon. Names that did not belong to pulpits or city councils, but to men who understood the language of presence. Powell closed his eyes briefly, then opened them with a resolve that felt heavier than any sermon he had ever prepared. I won't ask for violence, he said firmly. But I won't allow terror to masquerade as authority either. The decision to seek out Bumpy Johnson was not made lightly. Powell dressed with care that evening, not out of vanity but respect. He walked through Harlem streets that seemed to watch him in return, past faces that registered recognition and curiosity. By the time he reached the club, his steps were steady, though his heart carried the weight of what he was risking. Not just his reputation, but the moral clarity he had built his ministry upon. Inside, the atmosphere shifted subtly as Powell entered. Not with hostility, but awareness. Bumpy noticed him immediately, rising from his seat without haste. The handshake they exchanged was firm, unremarkable in appearance, but layered with mutual understanding. Powell spoke plainly, without dramatics, laying out the threats. Vandalism, the quiet terror creeping into his congregation's lives. He did not exaggerate. He did not plead. He simply stated the injustice and waited. Bumpy listened the way few men did fully. When Powell finished, the room seemed to hold its breath. Bumpy's response, when it came, was measured. You're not asking for protection, he said. You're asking for dignity to be respected. Yes, Powell replied, and for fear to lose its voice. Bumpy nodded once. Fear only speaks when it thinks it won't be answered. He did not promise action. He did not issue threats. He simply stood, adjusted his jacket, and surveyed the room with a quiet authority that required no explanation. Men who noticed straightened unconsciously, conversations tapering off without instruction. "Gentlemen," Bumpy said calmly, "finish your drinks. We'll be taking a walk." What followed was not a mob, not a spectacle, but a procession of restraint. 40 men rose not armed with rage, but with composure. They moved as one not because they were ordered to, but because they understood what was being communicated. This was not about territory. This was about principle. Powell felt his chest tighten as he realized the gravity of what was unfolding, not a rescue born of chaos, but a statement forged from unity. As they stepped into the Harlem night, Powell walked slightly ahead, the church visible down the block like a sentinel waiting to see whether it would stand or fall. Bumpy positioned himself at the center of the group, his presence anchoring the moment. When the men responsible for the threats appeared at the corner, hesitant, unprepared for what confronted them, the power of restraint became undeniable. No words were shouted. No weapons were displayed. Bumpy spoke once, quietly, his voice carrying certainty rather than menace. "This ends tonight." The men retreated not because they were forced to, but because they understood they had been seen, and seeing, in Harlem, carried consequences. When the street finally emptied, silence returned, but it was different now. It was full, not hollow. Reverend Powell stood on the church steps long after the men dispersed, emotion pressing against his composure. He had not compromised his faith. He had not invited violence. He had witnessed something rarer: power exercised with discipline, justice asserted without cruelty. Harlem, in its complicated way, had reminded him that dignity could be defended without being stained. And somewhere behind him, as dawn began to hint at the edges of the sky, Bumpy Johnson walked away without looking back. Another injustice, corrected not through noise, but through presence. Harlem did not forget what it witnessed on the church steps that night, but neither did the men who had driven away beneath the weight of 40 unflinching silhouettes. The quiet that followed was not surrender, it was calculation. In neighborhoods shaped by long memory, humiliation did not evaporate, it fermented. Reverend Samuel Powell sensed it first, not in broken glass or folded letters, but in the way strangers lingered too long at the edge of Sunday services, their hats low, their eyes scanning faces rather than listening to scripture. The church was full that morning, more full than it had been in months, the pews crowded with men who had once considered themselves too busy for sermons, but who now sat upright, shoulders squared, as though attendance itself were an act of declaration. Powell stood at the pulpit beneath stained glass glowing in patient colors, aware that his words would not only guide his congregation, but also travel beyond those walls. He spoke not of retaliation, nor of defiance, but of stewardship, the tiva responsibility each person carried to protect what was sacred without surrendering the soul in the process. He did not mention Bumpy Johnson by name, but gratitude flickered in his voice like light through the window panes. Yet even as the congregation sang louder than usual, Powell felt something unsettled in the air. Fear had retreated, yes, but pride had replaced it, and pride, when provoked, often invited escalation. The city beyond Harlem did not appreciate symbols it could not control. A black church standing firm with visible solidarity unsettled certain men who believed authority flowed only downward, never upward. By midweek, the whispers returned, this time not as anonymous threats, but as bureaucratic precision. A city inspector arrived unannounced, clipboard in hand, citing structural concerns that had apparently gone unnoticed for decades. Electrical violations, capacity limits, fire code discrepancies that required immediate review. The timing was too convenient to ignore. Powell listened respectfully as the inspector explained that unless repairs were completed within 10 days, services would be suspended. The congregation would be relocated for safety. The word relocation hung in the sanctuary like a polite eviction notice. Powell asked measured questions, received rehearsed answers, and watched as the inspector departed with a faint expression of satisfaction. It was not flames that had arrived this time. It was paperwork. And paperwork, Powell understood, could burn more quietly but just as completely. That evening, he walked once more through Harlem streets, the rhythm of jazz returning to its nightly cadence. The club lights shimmered against the pavement, laughter spilling outward in waves that seemed, at first glance, untouched by outside pressures. Inside Bumpy Johnson's establishment, the atmosphere remained controlled, dignified, deliberate. Bumpy sat in his usual place, not because he required a throne but because consistency itself was power. When Powell entered, there was no surprise in Bumpy's eyes, only a subtle tightening that suggested he had already anticipated the next move. They couldn't burn it, Powell said calmly after taking his seat. So they've decided to close it. Bumpy listened without interruption as Powell described the citations, the looming deadline, the quiet efficiency of the strategy. When Powell finished, he did not plead for intervention. He simply looked across the table, his gaze steady. I will not allow our church to become a pawn in a lesson about obedience. Bumpy folded his hands. Fear tried noise first, he said softly. Now it's trying rules. Dutch Schultz, seated nearby, leaned back with a faint exhale. Time had carved caution into his once brash demeanor, but he recognized leverage when he saw it. City offices don't move that fast unless someone pushes, Dutch observed, not with accusation but recognition. Bumpy nodded once. And someone believes we'll push back the wrong way. Silence settled between them, thick but thoughtful. Powell felt the weight of his earlier relief begin to fracture. The men who opposed him were no longer acting from shadows. They were using the city's own mechanisms as weapons. The injustice had evolved. It had become respectable. What do you intend to do? Powell asked quietly. Bumpy did not answer immediately. He stood instead, crossing the room slowly, speaking briefly with two men near the bar, then another by the stage. His voice remained low, his posture composed, no urgency, no theatrics. When he returned to the table, his expression was unchanged, but something decisive had crystallized behind his eyes. Tomorrow, he said, we visit the building department. Powell blinked. With 40 men? No, Bumpy replied. With facts. The following morning unfolded not with spectacle, but with orchestration. Harlem awoke to find that contractors licensed, insured, impeccably credentialed, had begun assessing the church's structure. Electricians reviewed wiring. Plumbers inspected pipes. A retired architect who owed Bumpy a favor examined the building's foundation with meticulous care. Powell watched in astonishment as clipboards filled not with threats, but with solutions. Repairs that might have taken months were scheduled within hours. Materials arrived. Permits were secured with quiet efficiency. Bumpy did not storm the city offices. He fortified the church beyond reproach. Yet even as progress unfolded, resistance simmered elsewhere. In a downtown office overlooking streets, far removed from Harlem's pulse, a councilman listened impatiently as aides reported that the church would likely pass inspection ahead of schedule. The plan had been simple: pressure the reverend into retreat, demonstrate that symbolic unity carried consequences. Instead, it appeared that Harlem had responded not with outrage, but with organization. The councilman leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, irritation sharpening his tone. If they want to play by the book, he said coolly, we'll rewrite the book. That rewrite arrived 2 days later in the form of a public notice. The block containing Powell's church was now under review for urban redevelopment. Eminent domain was mentioned delicately, almost apologetically. The language suggested modernization, progress, safety. But Powell understood what it meant. His church would not be fined. It would be erased. The announcement rippled through Harlem like a sudden drop in temperature. Congregants gathered in clusters along sidewalks, newspapers folded tightly and trembling. Hands, some argued for legal battles. Others whispered about moving services temporarily. Fear, once again, hovered near the surface. Powell felt its return like a familiar ache. He had believed the previous confrontation to be the storm. Now, he realized it had only been the warning. That evening, he returned to Bumpy's club with a heaviness he could no longer disguise. The music seemed softer than usual, the air thicker. Bumpy met him with the same calm as before, but there was steel beneath it now. "They want the land," Bumpy said before Powell spoke. "Not the building." "Yes," Powell admitted. "And they expect us to scatter quietly," Bumpy considered this. "They mistake our composure for surrender." Dutch leaned forward slightly. "You can't strong-arm City Hall," he murmured, almost to himself. Bumpy's eyes flickered toward him. "No," he agreed. "But you can remind it who lives here." The turning point did not come with raised voices or dramatic gestures. It came with a single deliberate decision. Bumpy organized a meeting, not of enforcers, not of men accustomed to settling disputes in back rooms, but of business owners, veterans, union representatives, teachers, and pastors from across Harlem. Invitations were extended personally, each delivered with quiet gravity. When the night arrived, the club was transformed into a forum. Tables were rearranged, the band dismissed early, chairs aligned in deliberate order. Powell stood near the back at first, unsure how his presence fit within this broader assembly of influence. Bumpy took the floor without introduction. He did not pace. He did not shout. "A church on 138th Street stands on land some men believe would look better without it," he began evenly. "They call it redevelopment. I call it displacement." He let the words settle. "This is not about one building," he continued. "It is about whether Harlem's institutions answer to the people who built them or the people who discovered them." The room remained silent, but the silence was attentive, not hesitant. "We will not threaten," Bumpy said. "We will not vandalize. We will not confirm the story they expect to tell about us. Instead, we will purchase every adjacent property. On that block that comes up for sale, we will invest. We will renovate. We will demonstrate that Harlem's future is not for sale to those who misunderstand it." Powell felt his breath catch. This was not defense. It was strategy. Dutch regarded Bumpy thoughtfully, then nodded once. "That," he admitted quietly, "is how you corner a room without raising your voice." Within weeks, storefronts changed. Hands, businesses once struggling, quietly found new partnerships. Renovations began, not flashy, not ostentatious, but steady. The block transformed from neglected to vibrant. Community events were hosted in the church courtyard. Veterans organized job fairs. Teachers held evening literacy programs. The church was no longer an isolated structure. It was the heart of a growing network. City officials, watching from a distance, recognized the shift. Redevelopment, once framed as improvement, now threatened to appear as intrusion. Public sentiment favored preservation. Newspaper columns praised grassroots revitalization. The narrative had turned. The councilman who had once leaned back with confidence now faced questions he could not easily deflect. Eminent domain requires justification. Justification weakens when the community thrives visibly. Quietly, the review was postponed, then delayed. Eventually, it dissolved altogether, replaced by language celebrating community-led progress. The night the announcement reached Harlem, there was no parade, no chanting. Powell stood once more at his pulpit, the sanctuary brighter than it had been in years, and spoke about stewardship fulfilled. Tears moved openly this time, not from fear, but from relief so deep it felt like release. He did not glorify confrontation. He honored cooperation. After the service, Powell found Bumpy standing near the church steps, hat in hand, gaze turned toward the renovated storefronts glowing softly beneath streetlights. "You did not fight them," Powell said quietly. Bumpy shook his head. No, I showed them we were already here. Dutch approached, offering a rare half-smile. Turns out, he remarked, progress looks different depending on who's holding the blueprint. They stood together in reflective silence, three men shaped by different paths, but aligned by principle. The injustice that had begun as hatred had evolved into policy, and policy had been answered not with violence, but with vision. Harlem had spoken, not loudly, not recklessly, but clearly. As the night deepened, neighbors lingered on stoops without fear, children chasing one another. Beneath streetlights, laughter returning not as defiance, but as normalcy. The church remained where it had always stood, not as a relic, but as a reminder that dignity, once defended wisely, could outlast even the most calculated opposition. And in the quiet space, between jazz notes drifting from the club and hymns echoing from the sanctuary, Harlem learned something enduring. That power exercised with patience can reshape even the systems designed to suppress it. Victory, when it comes quietly, has a way of unsettling men who profit from noise. Harlem's block on 138th Street had become a symbol without ever announcing itself as one. Storefronts glowed with renewed purpose. Children's voices spilled into the evenings without the old nervous urgency, and the church, still scarred, still imperfect, stood taller simply because it was no longer alone. Yet beneath that steadiness, a pressure began to build, slow and deliberate, like the tightening of a vice that did not intend to snap quickly. Reverend Samuel Powell felt it during moments that should have been peaceful, when he locked the church doors after evening prayer and sensed footsteps lingering too long across the street. When unfamiliar cars idled near the corner and left without reason, when donors who had once pledged openly now offered support only in whispers. Harlem had survived the first test of force and the second test of bureaucracy. What approached next would be subtler, more corrosive, a test of endurance. The pressure announced itself one morning in the form of a lawsuit. It arrived on heavy paper, delivered with professional courtesy and legal language so polished it almost sounded apologetic. The church, it claimed, had violated zoning regulations by hosting non-religious gatherings that disrupted commercial interests. The list of grievances was long, precise, and designed to exhaust rather than persuade. Powell sat in his office reading the document line by line, the sound of children rehearsing hymns drifting faintly through the walls. The irony was not lost on him. The very community activities that had saved the block were now being recast as threats. He closed the folders slowly, pressing his palms flat against the desk, and felt a familiar question rise within him, heavier now than before. How much resistance can dignity endure before it fractures? Word traveled quickly. By evening, the pews were full again, not with celebration, but with uncertainty. Some congregants urged caution. Others spoke with frustration. Sharpened by fatigue, legal battles cost money. They cost time. They cost emotional reserves already stretched thin. Powell listened to every voice without interruption, absorbing the fear and resolve alike. When silence finally settled, he stood and spoke with the same calm he had cultivated through every storm. This church was built by hands that believed. Tomorrow was worth investing in, he said evenly. If the cost of standing is patience, then patience is what we will spend. But we will not retreat into invisibility. We did not come this far to become quiet again. Still, when the meeting ended, Powell felt the weight return. Moral certainty did not erase practical consequences. Lawyers required retainers. Court dates disrupted routines. The threat was no longer immediate destruction. It was attrition. And attrition, Powell knew, could erode faith as surely as fire. Across Harlem, Bumpy Johnson watched the shift with measured concern. He had anticipated resistance, but the method unsettled him, not because it was unfamiliar, but because it was effective. Systems designed to appear impartial often carried the sharpest edges. He convened fewer meetings now, spoke even less than usual, choosing instead to observe patterns. Which businesses were suddenly audited? Which permits were delayed? Which voices in the neighborhood were being quietly pressured to distance themselves? From the church, it was not a frontal assault. It was an isolation campaign. Dutch Schultz, whose instincts had once thrived on confrontation, sensed the same danger. "They're trying to bleed you slow," he said one night, his tone stripped of bravado. "Make it too expensive to keep standing." Bumpy nodded. "They want us to choose between dignity and survival. And you don't like choices like that," Dutch added. "No," Bumpy replied evenly. "Because they're false." The next move did not come from City Hall or courtrooms, but from a place far closer to home. One evening, as Powell prepared to leave the church, he noticed a young man sitting alone on the front steps. He was well dressed but uneasy, his hands clasped tightly as though he were bracing himself. When Powell approached, the man rose quickly, eyes darting. "Reverend," he said, voice low, "I work downtown. I shouldn't be here." Powell listened as the man explained that he had been approached by representatives of a development. Firm, polite, professional, persuasive. They had offered him advancement, security, a future his parents could only dream of. In exchange, they wanted testimony. Statements about noise complaints. Claims of disruptive gatherings. "They said it wouldn't hurt anyone," the man whispered. "Just paperwork, just words." Powell felt a quiet ache settle in his chest. This was the cruelty of the strategy, turning neighbors into instruments, forcing individuals to weigh. Personal survival against collective integrity. He placed a hand on the man's shoulder. "They are asking you to become smaller than you are," he said gently. "I cannot make this choice for you. But know this, whatever you decide, you are still welcome here." The man left without another word, his posture heavy with indecision. Powell watched him disappear into the night, and wondered how many others had received similar offers. The injustice had become intimate now, pressing individuals into corners where there were no easy answers. When Powell shared this with Bumpy, the room fell silent. This was the moment Bumpy had hoped to avoid, the point where resistance demanded sacrifice, not from institutions, but from individuals. "They're testing the spine of the community," Bumpy said quietly, "seeing who bends." "And if they succeed?" Powell asked. "Then they won't need courts," Bumpy replied. "The work will be done for them." The turning point came not through confrontation, but confession. Bumpy arranged a gathering at the club, smaller than before. Invitation only, no speeches, no press. Just people who had been quietly approached, quietly pressured, quietly tempted. The atmosphere was not accusatory. It was protective. Bumpy spoke plainly, without judgment. "You're being asked to carry weight that doesn't belong to you." He said, "That weight will not make you stronger. It will only make you alone." He did not promise immunity. He did not offer compensation. He offered something rarer, solidarity without coercion. "If you choose to stand," he said, "you will not stand by yourself. If you choose not to, you will not be condemned here. But know that silence bought with fear costs more than it pays." The room remained quiet long after he finished. Then, one by one, people spoke not dramatically, but honestly. A shop owner admitted to receiving threats disguised as inspections. A teacher described pressure to sign a complaint. A young mother confessed fear for her children's safety. Each story layered the truth thicker, until isolation dissolved into shared understanding. The strategy of division faltered in the presence of collective honesty. The following week, something unexpected happened. Several affidavits submitted against the church were quietly withdrawn. A few individuals publicly recanted their statements, citing misrepresentation. Local papers, once cautious, began to ask questions, not about the church's activities, but about the motivations behind the lawsuit. The narrative shifted again, this time toward scrutiny of those who had engineered the pressure, but scrutiny invites retaliation. One night, as Powell returned home, he noticed his door ajar. Nothing was taken, nothing broken. The message was unmistakable. "We can still reach you." Powell stood in the doorway for a long moment, the familiar question returning heavier than ever. Fear pressed in, sharp and personal. For the first time since the threats began, he felt truly alone. He did not call the police. He called Bumpy. Bumpy arrived without fanfare, standing beside Powell in the quiet apartment, surveying the untouched room with eyes that missed nothing. "They want you rattled," he said softly. "It worked," Powell admitted. Bumpy turned to him, his voice calm but firm. "Then we answer differently." The answer came the next morning in a single decisive action that required no confrontation. Powell announced that Sunday's service would be held outdoors, in the open air, on the very block under dispute. Not as protest, not as spectacle, as worship. Chairs were arranged neatly, music was restrained. Families gathered in daylight, visible, unhidden. Bumpy did not stand at the front. He stood among the people, indistinguishable in posture, unmistakable in presence. The service unfolded with quiet power. Powell spoke of courage not as defiance, but as consistency, the choice to remain visible when invisibility feels safer. He spoke of faith not as belief without fear, but as movement through it. Passersby slowed. Neighbors watched from windows. The block became a sanctuary without walls. Those who had hoped fear would shrink the church now faced a different reality. Visibility strengthened as the final hymn faded. Silence settled, not the brittle silence of intimidation, but the deep, affirming quiet that follows truth spoken plainly. Powell closed his eyes briefly, emotion rising unbidden. When he opened them, he saw faces no longer bowed, shoulders no longer hunched. Dignity had not been defended with force or fury, but with presence that refused to disappear. From a distance, men who had once calculated outcomes now recalculated risks. Pressure loses potency when it fails to isolate. And isolation fails when people choose to stand where they can be seen. That night, Harlem breathed easier, not because the battle was over, but because the community had proven something essential to itself. The cost of standing had been high, but the cost of retreat would have been higher still. And in the quiet aftermath, as chairs were folded and families drifted home, Bumpy Johnson watched the block with measured satisfaction. The test had deepened. The stakes had risen. But the spine of Harlem had held. The final reckoning, he knew, was coming. And when it did, it would not be about property, permits, or paper. It would be about legacy, who Harlem belonged to, and who would be remembered when the noise finally faded. There are moments in a community's life when the outcome does not depend on force, or money, or even strategy, but on whether its people believe their story is worth finishing. Harlem had reached that moment without ceremony. The lawsuit remained unresolved. The development proposal still hovered in distant offices, and Reverend Samuel Powell's congregation continued to worship beneath a sky that had become both sanctuary and symbol. Yet something deeper had shifted beneath the surface. The campaign against the church had failed to fracture the neighborhood, and in failing, it had exposed something far more dangerous to those who preferred quiet compliance, resolve rooted in dignity. The final escalation came without warning, delivered not by letter or lawsuit, but by rumor. Word began to circulate that a closed-door vote was scheduled at City Hall, an expedited measure that would reclassify the entire block under Emergency Redevelopment Authority. If passed, it would override pending legal disputes and clear the path for immediate acquisition. The speed of the maneuver was its power. It would leave little time for appeal, little space for protest. By the time Harlem understood what had happened, it would be too late. Powell received confirmation late in the afternoon from a journalist who had quietly followed the story from the beginning. The vote was scheduled for the following evening. No public announcement, no formal hearing, just a swift administrative decision disguised as efficiency. Powell hung up the telephone and sat motionless in his office, sunlight slanting through the stained glass windows in fractured patterns. Across the floor, he felt neither panic nor anger at first, only a profound weariness. How many times could a community prove its worth before being permitted to keep it? He walked to the sanctuary and stood alone at the pulpit. The church was empty, but it did not feel hollow. It felt watchful. "We have done everything right," he murmured softly, as though the walls might answer. "We have answered injustice with integrity. We have answered fear with presence. What more is required?" Across Harlem, Bumpy Johnson received the same news within minutes. He did not react outwardly. He set down the receiver with the same deliberate calm he carried into every room. But those who knew him well noticed the stillness deepen behind his eyes. This was no longer about property, nor about strategy. This was about precedent. If a block revitalized by its own people could be erased quietly, then no effort in Harlem would ever truly be secure. Dutch Schultz arrived at the club that evening earlier than usual, his hat tucked beneath his arm, his expression stripped of its usual ironic detachment. "They're trying to finish it fast," he said, not bothering with pleasantries. "Yes," Bumpy replied evenly. "Because they think speed will keep us from gathering. And will it?" Bumpy considered that question carefully before answering. "Only if we let it." The decision that followed was neither loud nor reckless. It was precise. Bumpy did not call for protest. He did not organize confrontation. Instead, he began making telephone calls, not to men accustomed to enforcing will, but to men and women accustomed to shaping perception. Journalists, union leaders, veterans associations, business owners who had invested in the block, pastors from neighboring congregations. Each conversation was brief, deliberate, and calm. The message was the same: be present tomorrow evening. Powell, meanwhile, gathered his deacons and congregation in an emergency meeting. He did not dramatize the threat. He explained it clearly, allowing the weight of it to settle naturally. Some wept quietly. Others clenched their fists. A few spoke of marching to City Hall in outrage. Powell raised a hand gently. "We will not confirm the narrative they expect," he said steadily. "We will not appear as chaos. We will appear as community." The following evening, as city council members filed into a modest chamber, expecting routine procedure, something unusual awaited them. The gallery was full. Not crowded with noise, but filled with presence. Ministers in dark suits, mothers holding children, veterans wearing polished medals, shop owners in pressed shirts, reporters with notepads poised. And near the back, seated with quiet composure, was Bumpy Johnson, his hat resting neatly on his knee, his gaze steady and unreadable. Council members exchanged uncertain glances. This vote, meant to pass unnoticed, had drawn witnesses. The proceedings began with rehearsed language about progress, efficiency, and modernization. But when the floor opened for brief public comment, an opportunity often treated as formality, Reverend Powell rose. He walked to the podium without haste, his posture upright, his expression composed. He did not speak loudly. He did not accuse. He did not threaten. "For generations," he began calmly, "our church has served this block not as an obstacle to progress, but as its foundation. We have revitalized storefronts, created programs for veterans, educated children, and fostered business partnerships. If this council believes that erasing such work constitutes emergency redevelopment, then the emergency is not ours." Silence settled thickly across the chamber. "We ask only for consistency," Powell continued. "If our efforts qualify as disruption, then define clearly what qualifies as contribution." He stepped back without flourish, returning to his seat among his people. A murmur rippled faintly through the room, not outrage, but reflection. council members shifted uneasily. Cameras captured expressions not of defiance, but of dignity. Then something unexpected occurred. Dutch Schultz, whose presence in such a chamber might once have been controversial, rose slowly. His reputation preceded him, but his tone carried none of its old volatility. "I've built businesses in this city," he said plainly, "and I've seen neighborhoods decline when they're ignored. This block hasn't declined, it's improved. If redevelopment punishes improvement, perhaps the definition needs reconsideration." It was not a speech, it was a statement. And, in its brevity, it unsettled assumptions. Finally Bumpy stood. He did not approach the podium immediately. He removed his hat first, holding it respectfully at his side before stepping forward. The room seemed to narrow around him, not from fear, but from gravity. He spoke only once. "Harlem is not asking permission to exist," he said evenly. "It is asking to be recognized for what it has already done. No elaboration, no warning, just truth." He returned to his seat. The council chamber remained silent for several long seconds. The speed that had once favored the measure now worked against it. Cameras were recording, reporters were scribbling. The narrative had shifted from quiet efficiency to public accountability. When the vote was called, hesitation replaced certainty. 2 members who had been expected to support the measure abstained. 1 requested further review. The motion failed to pass. It was not an explosion of triumph. It was a quiet, decisive pause in the machinery that had assumed momentum. Outside City Hall, night had fallen fully. The crowd that emerged did not cheer. They exhaled. Powell stood beneath streetlights that cast long shadows, tears rising unbidden. He had not shouted. He had not begged. He had not compromised his principles. He had stood and been seen. Bumpy approached him without ceremony. "It's not over," he said softly. "No," Powell agreed. But tonight it paused. "That's enough for now." In the weeks that followed, the redevelopment proposal quietly dissolved. Official language framed it as reconsideration, then reevaluation, then withdrawal. The lawsuit against the church was settled out of court, dismissed without fanfare. The pressure campaign, deprived of secrecy, lost its force. Harlem returned to its rhythm, not untouched, but strengthened, on the first Sunday after the council vote. Powell delivered a sermon unlike any he had given before. He spoke of endurance not as suffering alone, but as steadfastness guided by wisdom. He spoke of men who understood that true authority did not need spectacle. He spoke of community as covenant, a promise made not in ink, but in presence. The final hymn ended. Powell looked toward the back of the sanctuary. Bumpy stood there, hat in hand, listening quietly. Dutch stood beside him, posture reflective rather than restless. They did not seek acknowledgement. They did not remain long. As they stepped outside, Harlem shimmered beneath evening light, storefronts alive, children playing, laughter drifting easily into the air. The church doors remained open, not because they had been defended with violence, but because they had been defended with clarity. "Funny thing about standing still," Dutch murmured as they paused on the sidewalk. "It makes other people move." Bumpy allowed the faintest hint of a smile. "Only if you stand long enough." He turned then and walked back towards 7th Avenue, the club lights glowing in the distance like steady embers. He did not look back. He did not need to. Behind him, Reverend Samuel Powell remained on the church steps for a long moment, watching neighbors greet one another with ease restored. He understood now that the battle had never been about land alone. It had been about whether a community could define itself without apology. And in that understanding, something deeper than victory settled into Harlem, a quiet assurance that dignity, once chosen, does not easily surrender. The night air was still, almost reverent. Harlem had stood. And because it stood without hatred, without chaos, without abandoning its moral center, it would endure.